ladies, thank you so much for joining me back for the Showstopper Bread Week. We were given the assignment to create a bread sculpture. Now, those of you who know me know I am a huge history geek. If I had to narrow it down, British history would be my very favorite, of course. And if I had to narrow it down even more, it would be Royal British history. That being said, my bread sculpture is a Tudor rose. Now, those of you who don't know what a Tudor rose is, it came about when the House of Lancaster and the House of York united as one. So King Henry VII, who was a Lancastrian red rose, and Elizabeth of York, who was a white rose, got married. To commemorate this unification and to squash the feud between both houses, King Henry VII created the Tudor rose. So it's red on the outside and white on the inside to represent both houses. King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's second son later on became King Henry VIII, who is infamous for having 6 wives, amongst other things. He didn't have 6 wives all at the same time, but he kept remarrying to try to produce an heir. So my bread sculpture represents Henry VIII's 6 wives, and I will explain how at the end. So let's begin.
The first thing I'm going to do is scald the milk. Scalding is a process where you bring the temperature up to where you could just see the bubbles around the side of the pan and removing it from the heat. I'm adding some water and butter to bring the temperature down to 110 degrees Fahrenheit before I add it to my flour mixture. I had to scald the milk to denature the proteins, which will help the bread be light and fluffy. And here I have bread flour, yeast, sugar, and salt. I'm adding my milk mixture and some eggs. I'm using some butter to grease a big bowl so my dough doesn't stick when I place it in here to prove. This dough has been kneading for about 10 minutes, and because the machine is using such force, even though it's at a low setting, the bowl tends to get stuck. So I usually just give it a little whack and it pops right out. Now, as you can see, the dough is still quite sticky, so I'm just going to flour my bench and knead it until it's at the window pane stage. That means when I stretch it out, I should be able to see through the dough without it breaking. It's just to ensure I have created enough gluten. You can see here when I stretch it out, you can sort of see through the dough, but it's still intact, so this is almost ready. I'm just tucking the dough in on itself before I place it into the greased bowl, and it's going to prove for about an hour. Now I'm moving on to my breadstick dough. In here I have bread flour, yeast, salt, sugar, water, butter, and olive oil. I'm just going to knead it for about 5 minutes, and this is going into a bowl to prove for an hour. While both of the doughs are proving, I'm starting on my fillings. I'm making raspberry jam by adding a squeeze of lemon juice and some sugar. I'm going to stir it around until the sugar is dissolved and then bring it to a boil. It should eventually look like this, and then I can take it off the heat and pour it into a bowl to cool. With the other half of my lemon, I'm going to add it to my cream cheese filling, which is cream cheese, sugar, lemon zest, lemon juice, a little bit of creme fraiche, or you can just use sour cream, a little bit of vanilla bean paste, and I'm going to give it a quick whisk and pop it in the fridge. I already went ahead and made some passion fruit curd. If you want to know how to make curds, it's in my eclair video and my ginger lemon cake video. I also made some chocolate creme patissier. I made coffee creme patissier in my eclair video, so if you'd like, you can watch the how-to method there. My dough is ready now, so I'm going to just punch some of the air out with my fingertips and cut a small portion of it to make cornets. I'm placing the dough back into the bowl and covering it so it doesn't dry out while I work on the cornets. So I'm taking that portion I cut out and dividing it into 5 equal pieces. First, I'm going to roll them up so they're nice and smooth, and then I can roll each one out into long ropes and wrap it around these cones. I want to ensure these are wrapped well without gaps, so when I fill them later, it won't leak filling. I'm going to set these aside to prove while I get to work on the rest of the sculpture. With the remainder of the dough, I'm just cutting a small portion off and putting it to the side while I divide this into 5 equal pieces. I'm covering up the rest of the dough so it doesn't dry. I'm rolling these out and giving them a quick braid. Now I'm just rolling them up and inserting these pie weights or baking beans that I've wrapped in parchment paper. I'm placing those weights in the middle so I can add the filling later, but you'll see in a bit. The Tudor rose has 5 red petals on the outside and 5 smaller white petals on the inside. I'm adding this ramekin in the middle because that will later on be the middle of the flower. Now I'm putting this aside for a moment while I get to work on the 5 smaller petals. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did earlier, Except this time, I'm not going to braid it, I'm just going to give it a little twist. This really had more to do with the time restraint we had. When I was prepping for the bake-off, I didn't want to be behind and put the bread into the oven too late, which is why I settled for twists and not braids for this one. I'm adding my 5 small petals and putting this aside to proof for about half an hour while I get to work on my breadstick. I'm doing the same thing I did earlier and just punching some air out. I just need a small piece so I can roll it out and create the stem. I'm also flattening a piece of dough out with my hand and using a teardrop-shaped cutter to cut out the leaves. These don't need a second proof, so I'm just going to pop these into the oven along with my cornets. I've melted some butter and combined some cinnamon and sugar together. The breadsticks are baked, so I'm brushing on some butter and sprinkling it with cinnamon and sugar. The roast is done proving, so I'm going to pop this in the oven real quick while I get my fillings ready. The raspberry jam is nicely set. I'm putting it into a piping bag so I can pipe it onto the bread quickly and efficiently. I'm doing the same with the cream cheese filling. The bread is almost fully baked, but I need to add the filling, so I'm removing the weights and adding the jam. I'm going to do the same for the inside and add the cream cheese filling. Now this needs to go back into the oven for about 10 minutes. I'm filling my piping bag with a chocolate creme pâtissier and another with the passion fruit curd. The passion fruit curd is for the middle of my flour, and I'm also adding 6 pomegranate seeds to it. Moving on to the cornets, these cornets represent leaves. I'm filling each one with creme pâtissier and topping them off with a cherry. Now for the finishing touch, I'm adding the stem and leaves. The story behind my bread sculpture lies within each part of the flower, which represents the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Beginning with the first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whose badge was the pomegranate, I've placed 6 pomegranate seeds in the middle, for obvious reasons. The next is Anne Boleyn. The passion fruit curd is to represent the passionate relationship she had with Henry VIII. The third wife was Jane Seymour, who was nicknamed Plain Jane, who was also known as the sweet and kind one. I used the sweet and plain bread, and the white cream cheese filling represents her fair complexion. The cornets are for Anne of Cleves, who was German. I filled it with the flavors of a German cake, Black Forest Gâteau, or Black Forest cake. The breadsticks represents Catherine Howard. Her badge was the Tudor rose with a stem, and Henry VIII called her his rose without a thorn. The cinnamon sugar is for the spicy nature of her personality and the scandal that led to her demise. Last but not least, the 6th wife. The red petals represents Catherine Parr's favorite color, which was crimson.
So that's the end of my bread sculpture. I really hope you enjoyed that. I wanted this bread to be a really fun bread to eat. You could take the breadsticks and dip it in passion fruit curd and even the bread if you wanted to. You could just, it's like a tear and share, so you don't really necessarily need a knife to cut through it. And most importantly, I just really wanted it to taste good. I didn't want it to just be aesthetically pleasing to the eye. I really wanted it to taste good. And as you can see, everything is very natural. There's no food coloring. I wanted to go for that rustic look. I thought about making the leaves green at one point when I was creating this recipe a long time ago, but nobody really wants to eat green bread. Do you? I don't know. And I really like the rustic look. I hope you join me back next week for the semi-final signature challenge where I will be making lavender honey pot de creme.